So if you're watching this video, it means you've just finished your topic on evolution, or you're about to do a test that evolution plays a really big part of. What we're going to do is we're going to do a quick summarization of everything you should have covered if you're looking at evolution in stage 5 science. So to start with, we need to break down evolution into two distinct categories. One is talking about the history of the theory, and the other one is talking about evidence that support it. Here's our list. So let's start with the theory itself. Evolution is based around a concept called natural selection. Now what this essentially means is, over many generations, a species will slowly begin to accumulate change. Now this could result in one species diverging and becoming two different species, so what we call divergent evolution, or two very different species on very different locations, evolving to have very similar traits to look as though they're related, also known as convergent evolution. If you've ever seen a picture of a Tasmanian devil, compare this to a picture of a wolverine. Now, a Tasmanian devil and a wolverine are not related in any way, shape, or form, yet they're both very small, furry mammals that are extremely aggressive and highly carnivorous. They even have the same sort of body shape, yet they evolved on the opposite sides of the planet. The reason why they evolved the same way is because they had similar solutions to similar problems. Now, the reason why things are going to change over time is because of variety. Okay? So if we have generation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth, going down, we're going to notice that over time, there are going to be unique traits that are born into each generation, often as a result of mutations or genetic abnormalities. So if we started off here, further, and further still. And as a population gets larger, we're increasing the possibility of certain individuals being born. Some individuals might be born with a peanut allergy. Others might be born with the ability to see a certain form of color that others can't. And depending upon the environment that they grow up in, some of these will be either very bad for their health or increase the chance of survival. Now, if you're more likely to survive until adulthood, that means you're more likely to get a partner and have children. These children will inherit your genes. So survival of the fittest, which is a term we often use with this, doesn't actually mean you have to be fast or strong or smart. It simply means that you're best likely to survive a particular scenario long enough to breed. So for instance, if I'm comparing a tiger to a rabbit, tigers might be faster, they might be stronger, they might be much more predatory. But a rabbit is more likely to survive because it can survive on various grasses, it can survive in many different ecosystems that a tiger couldn't. And as such, rabbits are able to breed more profusely. So in that instance, a rabbit is fitter than a tiger, okay? Now, the concept of evolution has been around for quite some time, and most people attribute it to being part of Charles Darwin, but he wasn't the only one. Alfred Wallace, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, these are all different what we call naturalists, or people who study the natural world, who wanted to understand how species came to be. You know, why do we have an elephant here, or a mouse there, why do we have a lion here, or an antelope there? And what led them to exist the way that they do? Jean-Baptiste Lamarck put forward an idea that in each generation, the accumulated traits or experiences are passed on to the next generation. His example was a giraffe. A giraffe might have originally looked like a normal horse, but it only wanted to eat the leaves at the very tops of trees. So each generation would crane their neck to try and reach taller and taller, and each generation would pass on the attributed muscle to the next generation. Now we know that's not true. You could have 5 generations of weightlifters, but that doesn't mean that you're going to have progressively musclier and musclier kids unless the people who were doing the weightlifting had those attributes genetically instilled in them, okay? You can't pass on traits you would accumulate throughout your life. I mean, you don't inherit a scar. You don't inherit a broken finger. because it's not based on genetics, it's based on lifestyle. Now, when Charles Darwin was a young man, his father originally wanted him to be a priest. He wasn't really interested in that, and so instead he wanted to become a naturalist. So in doing so, he boarded a ship called the SS Beagle. The SS Beagle traveled all around the world, and what Charles did, at each time they stopped somewhere, he'd get off and he'd sample some of the local plants and animals. He'd take samples, he'd draw pictures, he'd write notes, and then they'd move on to the next place. And one place in particular that was really important to him was a very small island off the coast of South America called the Galapagos Islands. Now, if you haven't heard of this before, this is a very quick summary. For those of you who have, you can just skip past this part. Now, the Galapagos Islands is located off the western coast of South America. So there's South America, and here might be the Galapagos Islands. And on the Galapagos Islands, there are different terrains and ecosystems and everything else. And what happened was we found finches were flying over from South America and landing here. Now, for whatever reason, many of them stayed. But what happened was something very, very different to what happened on the mainland. Seeing as they started to migrate to different areas in the island, so let's say here or here or here or here, and they found that they had to adapt in order to survive living off of the various foodstuffs that were there. So some of these finches had to eat grubs from the ground. Some of them had to eat termites from inside of a tree. Some of them had to eat beetles that sunk underwater somehow. And for each and every one, certain members of the species were more likely to survive than others because they had a very different shaped beak. So let's say we have three different species of finch. They came from the original. So let's say our original bird had a normal looking beak like this. Okay? Not particularly interesting. Now, let's imagine that this group of that particular species could only live off of very hard-shelled nuts that came off trees. Now, in order to do that, you had to crack them open. This one might have had a much stronger, sturdier beak, a little bit shorter. Imagine you had to get some out of a tree, like a termite. And a very long, thin beak in order to nose their way in. Imagine trying to get worms out of the ground in a bold area that often had tons of water. Now, as we can see, each of these beaks are designed for a particular skill, okay? Now, it doesn't that they were miraculously instantly appeared. Evolution takes many generations in order to happen. For humans, we have to be around about 18 years old before we can start reproducing and have kids safely, all right? That's 20 years. Compare that to an insect, which might be several months from when they're born to when they reach maturity and they can have offspring of their own. Hence, in the span of a 20-year period, insects might have had 20 generations, whereas humans might have only had one. So some species are able to evolve faster because they have a shorter lifespan and a shorter time to reach maturity. Various diseases change each and every year, hence the reason we have to change our inoculations. For instance, you might have to get an influenza vaccine every 12 months because the influenza virus changes. Not necessarily evolve, but it mutates. It's very unstable. Now, the causes and impacts. Nature works on a very simple principle. If something does not work, that particular instance of it occurring is going to die off. So, say for instance, we had humans evolving with one big muscly arm and one very small arm. Now, the odds of us surviving with that unique characteristic is going to be very, very small. It's easier and better for us for our survival if they were both equal size. So that way we can do equal things on both sides. If the muscle side was always on the right, that means we're always going to be vulnerable on the left. Okay? Now, another impact could be the physical abiotic factors that are available. Megafauna used to be a really big thing in Australia. We used to have wombats about the size of cars. We used to have massive, massive flora and fauna, but not primarily fauna. But we found that over time, our climate's composition was beginning to shift. Okay, so the increase of CO2 meant that the temperature overall in the area was increasing. Combine that with where Australia was located, and we found that a lot of megafauna were overheating too easily and began to die off. Hence the reason the largest of Australian animals is probably like an emu or kangaroo. Most of them are very small, because if they're smaller, they're able to release heat into the environment a lot easier. Compare this to, say, many animals that live in the Arctic Circle, up near the North Pole. They're very big and bulky because they have to insulate all that heat around them, okay? Small animals won't survive as well. So, the theory of evolution was often under a bit of contention because our understanding of it is still, pardon the phrase, evolving, it's changing. Now, Charles Darwin is the most recent one that we're still talking about and using as a basis. Many start to use natural selection in a different format, but for the instance of an exam that's coming up, you'll refer back to Charles Darwin as a default, okay? Now, evolution is like any theory. If it doesn't have supporting evidence for it, then it's out the door, it's gone. These 5 points are regarding evolution as a theory. So, let's break them down. The first one you have is comparative anatomy. Now, if you've been on Instagram at any point, you might have seen a document that looks a little bit like this. Okay? That post is a summarized mind map of everything I'm going to be covering in this video. So, if you're looking at, say, a pentadactyl limb, we have all the bones here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, a pentadactyl limb, or pentadactyl, simply translates to 5-fingered. Now, if you're looking at this image, you might instantly think it's an X-ray of a hand. But if I were to change the size and shape of the different bones they're in, it still has 5 fingers. But it could also be the fluke of a whale, so the fin that's on the side of a whale. It could be a bat's wing. It could be a dog's paw. It could be a lizard's leg. It could be a bird's foot. All of these different animals use the same concept. They have a limb that ends in 5 digits. Now, the reason why is because A, this particular shape of limb could be very advantageous for them. That 5th digit could be used to grab hold of things or manipulate other objects. Try opening a round door handle without your thumb. It's very difficult. Now, the second reason is that all of these animals could be descended from one particular species or a particular example of an animal that used its pentadactyl limb. That animal was so successful, it passed on this trait to its later generations. Consider like a car. Cars have 4 wheels. There were some cars recently that might have only had 3, or 2, or 5. But some of these were more successful than others. So a 2-wheel car obviously became a motorcycle. But there are not many 3-wheel cars or 5-wheel cars. 4-wheel cars worked best. Okay, you didn't need as many wheels and you were stable. Hence the reason they became so popular. Hence the reason every subsequent generation of car is probably going to have 4 wheels on it. Okay? Comparative embryology is a little bit different. If we compare different species of animals before they're born, they look very similar if you go really, really early. So, forgive my crude drawing, I'm just doing this on the fly. Now this is a very early example of an embryo. Now over time, embryos of different animals are going to start differentiating. So for instance, a fish is going to start having its tail lengthen out. These areas here are going to turn to gills. Compared to a human, this area might turn to lungs and a rib cage. This will drastically shorten down and start sprouting arms and legs. But there are certain aspects of this that you can already identify. This is spot. So if I'm looking at this, I can already identify that's an eye. This area might be the brain. This is an ear. This is where you breathe. This is a tail. Now, a lot of animals already have these traits. If you can think of any animal that has two heads on it, I'd be very surprised. Okay? If you can think of an animal where the brain is located directly in the center, there's not many. The reason why is because this setup speaks to a common ancestor as well, and because we're so successful, it's more likely to be common. It's more likely to be found in different species. All right, I'm gonna have to go a little bit faster, I'm nearly close to the bell. Now, comparative embryology and comparative anatomy look for similarities between different species. Fossil evidence looks for a comparison between a snapshot of species that happened a very long time ago. So you need to find a preserved sample. There are different types. One of the big ones are trace fossils. Okay, trace fossils are like a portion of that particular organism that's been set aside. So for instance, a sample of blood or a sample of bone, some fragment of them. It's very rare to find a complete specimen, perfectly preserved. Original material is like a large fragment of it. A trace fossil could even include stuff like a footprint, okay? Or what we call a mold or a cast. So if you're a dinosaur, you're walking around, you step into a particularly damp puddle, and the clay there is enough to retain the image of your foot, other stuff might fall into it. It dries out and it holds that shape. Now, trace, preserved, casts and molds. You also have petrified material. When something's being petrified, we think of being so scared that you stand still. In biology, a petrified piece of material is something that has been changed from organic to inorganic through chemical means. So say a dinosaur died and got buried under stuff. If it's been petrified, the bones that were there have been slowly leaching chemicals, and other chemicals are coming and taking their place, changing it from a bone into solid stone. You can find petrified wood if you go to certain areas that have really ancient forests. It looks like a piece of normal rock, but it has striations as if it were a wood chip, which is really interesting. The last one is preserved within, say, something like amber, okay, or within ice, within tar. You find this in like Jurassic Park, okay? It's the only way that we can preserve something long enough so that some semblance of DNA might survive, but it's unlikely. DNA, like everything else, degrades over time. Okay. Molecular biology is one of the more complex ones, but I'm going to explain it as simply as I can. DNA is the instructions that makes up a living organism. So I have DNA that makes me me. You have DNA that makes you you. And sometimes these DNA sets can be holding secret information that isn't really apparent at the time. So let's say I make a pattern. A, T, A, T, A, G, C, G, C, G. Let's say that's your pattern, okay? Normally this could be hundreds of millions of codons long, but we're only going to make it 10. Now I'm going to make a sample underneath it that I'm going to compare it to. So this one in the box is an organism that I'm studying. I want to compare it to other organisms. So A, T, A, T. Now, take a minute and see if you can point out which parts here are incorrect. All right, let's try a different one. Here's the second one. How many inconsistencies can you see between this and this? Now, let's say you want to compare these two different species to this top one. All right, we look for the parts that are different. So these two are different. And here, this one is different. So this first one has an 80% match, okay? Because it's 2 out of 10, which is, 20% different. This bottom one is 90. So what we would say is that this bottom one is more genetically related to this top one, even though they might look completely different. For instance, if you look at a hyena, they look like a dog, but based on molecular biology, they're actually more closely related to cats. They have more in common with their DNA. Okay? Now the last part we're looking at is biogeography. If you looked at plate tectonics when you were younger, you might have seen that different coastlines fit together like a jigsaw. The interesting point about this is that certain fossils that have been found in different locations, if we put these jigsaw pieces back together, they create a distinct area where they once all belonged. So something that might have existed in both Africa and South America, when it was all one continent, all came from a similar ancestor. All right, that's it from me. This has been a really quick video. Please ensure that you go back over the work you've been given in class, ask your teacher questions, and if you want to, feel free to hit up more of Instagram or TikTok to find more resources. All right? As always, I've been Fori. You guys have been amazing. I'll see you around.